A rifle shot cracked through the morning air. Smoke curled from the barrel as an old man was dragged from his home, while a woman's screams pierced the silence. "That paper isn't real!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. Two men held her back, as a third tossed a document onto the ground, its ink still fresh against the aged paper. The family's entire future lay crumpled in the dust, and no one in the street dared to move. The dust settled where it all began, not with a shot, but with a quiet morning on the Ashworth ranch. Arabella Ashworth moved through her home with practiced ease. The sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Her two children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. This had been her family's land for generations. Her father had worked it, her grandfather before him, and now she carried the responsibility. Silas Thorne arrived unannounced one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust as he stopped at her fence. He was a man who owned half the county already, but his eyes always seemed to drift toward what wasn't his. "Arabella," he said, tipping his hat. The gesture was polite, but his gaze held something else, something calculating. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, keeping her voice even, "what brings you to my property?" "I've been looking at the maps," he said. "Your land borders mine. We could be neighbors in more ways than one." Arabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "My family has owned this land for 60 years. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Thorne replied. He left a card with his name on it. "Think about it." The visits became more frequent. Then came the offers. Then the threats. Silas Thorne wasn't used to hearing no. Not from anyone. One morning, Arabella found notices posted on her gate. The bank was calling in a loan she knew nothing about. The documents were forged. She recognized the handwriting of Mortimer Langford, the town's notary who would do anything for the right price. She went to Sheriff Marlowe, but he just waved her away. "Thorne's a powerful man, Arabella. Best not make trouble." The night before they came for her land, Arabella sat with her children. They didn't understand why they had to leave. She didn't know how to explain that some men believed their power gave them the right to take what wasn't theirs. Then came the dawn, and with it, Silas Thorne's men, and the paper that would change everything. The dust hadn't settled when Arabella found herself standing on the edge of her property, watching as Silas Thorne's men began moving her family's belongings into a wagon. Her children clung to her skirts, their faces streaked with tears and dust. The forged deed lay on the ground where it had been thrown, its ink mocking the 60 years of her family's history. That document wasn't just paper. It was the Ashworth family's entire legacy. It contained the legal proof that her great-grandfather had purchased this land with gold from the California gold rush. It had her father's signature when he'd officially inherited it. It listed every acre, every boundary, every right that had been passed down through 4 generations. If that document disappeared forever, Silas Thorne would own everything: the house where she'd raised her children, the fields where they'd planted crops, the barn where her husband had worked before his passing. Everything. Arabella knew what Thorne planned. He'd done this before. 3 other families in the county had lost their land to similar legal maneuvers. Each time he'd expanded his empire, his grazing lands stretching farther across the valley. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a land baron who believed the frontier belonged to those with the most guns and the deepest pockets. The town's notary, Mortimer Langford, had been paid well to overlook the irregularities in the paperwork. The ink was too fresh on the signature lines. The dates didn't align with when her father had been alive. The property boundaries had been subtly redrawn to include a valuable spring that only existed on Ashworth land. But Arabella had the original, or she had. Until this morning, when Silas's men had taken it from her desk while she'd been tending to her sick daughter. They hadn't just taken her land. They'd taken the proof that it was ever hers. "We'll be at the poorhouse," she whispered to her children, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll figure this out." As they walked away from the only home they'd ever known, Arabella clutched the one piece of paper she still had, a receipt for the taxes she'd paid last month. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that she had been on this land. Proof that she had rights. In the distance, Silas Thorne watched from his horse, a satisfied smile on his face. He had no idea what he'd truly taken. No idea that the original deed wasn't the only proof of ownership. No idea that Arabella Ashworth wasn't about to give up without a fight. The poorhouse stood at the edge of town, a weathered wooden structure with a sagging roof and paint peeling in long strips. Arabella pushed open the heavy door, her children clinging to her skirts as they stepped inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp cloth and something medicinal that couldn't quite cover the scent of poverty. "We'll be all right," she told them, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just for now." The room was crowded with other displaced families, all sitting on rough-hewn benches or huddled against walls. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any noise could have been. Arabella found a corner away from the others, her back against the cold wall. She pulled out the tax receipt she'd saved, smoothing the creased paper with trembling fingers. It was all she had left, all the proof she needed that this land had been hers. Outside, a horse stopped, not at the hitching post, but directly in front of the poorhouse door. Arabella didn't look up. She couldn't bear to see another stranger's face, another offer of help that would lead nowhere. The door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. Tall, wearing a hat pulled low, a flash of red at the neck. Arabella tightened her grip on the paper. Her children instinctively moved closer, their small bodies pressing against hers. The stranger stepped inside. He didn't look around. His eyes found Arabella immediately. He moved toward her, his steps deliberate but not threatening. The other occupants of the room watched him, then quickly looked away when his gaze passed over them. He stopped a few feet away. Arabella finally looked up. She saw a man in his mid-30s with a full beard and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. A red bandana was knotted at his throat. His clothes were worn but clean. A rifle rested in its holster at his hip. He didn't speak right away, just watched her, watched the children, watched the piece of paper in her hand. "Your land?" he asked finally. His voice was low, calm, not challenging, just stating what he'd clearly figured out. Arabella nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She held up the tax receipt. "It's all I have left." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "The original deed," he said. "Where did you last see it?" Arabella blinked. How could this stranger know about the deed? How could he know it had been stolen along with everything else? Before she could answer, a voice from the doorway made her turn. Harriet Dunmore stood there, her face pale with fear. She'd been watching from outside, apparently. "The deed," Harriet whispered, her eyes darting toward the stranger. "I saw what happened. I saw the men take it." Arabella's heart leaped. Hope, fragile and dangerous, bloomed in her chest. Harriet never spoke up, never got involved. Not since Silas had threatened her after the last family lost their land. The stranger turned his attention to the older woman. His expression didn't change, but Arabella thought she saw something in his eyes, something like understanding. "Tell me," he said to Harriet, his voice still calm. "Tell me what you saw." Harriet took a step inside, then another, as if afraid the walls might close in on her. She kept glancing toward the door, as expecting Silas's men to burst in at any moment. "I was tending my roses," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the men go into your house, Arabella. They went straight to your desk, the tall one with the scar on his cheek. He knew exactly where to look." The stranger nodded. "Mortimer Langford's handwriting?" Harriet's eyes widened. You know about that? I've seen it before, the stranger replied. He turned back to Arabella. Where did you keep the original deed? Arabella swallowed hard. In the false bottom of my desk, the one my husband made himself. The stranger's gaze sharpened. And when was the last time you saw it? Last week, Arabella said. I was checking the boundaries, making sure the spring was still on our property. The stranger didn't say anything for a long moment. Just stood there, processing the information. Arabella held her breath, waiting for him to dismiss her, to tell her there was nothing that could be done. Instead, he asked one more question. Did anyone else know about the false bottom? Arabella thought back. Her husband had told her to keep it secret. Only she knew about it. Or so she thought. No, she said slowly. No one else, except... Except who? The stranger prompted. Arabella hesitated. My brother, Silas. He knew. We were close once, before he left. Before their father cast him out. Before he became the man who now owned everything she had left. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to be putting pieces together that Arabella couldn't see. Where would he have taken the deed? He asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge beneath it. Arabella shook her head. I don't know, but if he has it, it's hidden well. He's not a careless man. The stranger nodded. He didn't make any promises, didn't say he would help. Just stood there, his presence filling the small room, making the other occupants shrink back even further. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the poorhouse. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed in the sudden silence. Arabella stared after him, her heart pounding. Who was this man, and why had he asked about the deed? Beside her, Harriet let out a shaky breath. Who was that? She whispered. Arabella shook her head. I don't know. But he knew about the false bottom. He knew about Silas. Outside, the stranger mounted his horse. He didn't look back at the poorhouse, just sat there, his gaze fixed on the direction of Silas Thorne's ranch. His hand rested near his rifle, not touching it, but ready. He had a question to answer, and he knew exactly where to find it. The stranger rode toward Silas Thorne's ranch at a steady pace. The sun beat down on the dusty road, but he paid it no mind. His focus was entirely on the task ahead. Find the original deed. Expose the forgery. Give Arabella back what was rightfully hers. The Thorne Ranch loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of buildings and fences that seemed to stretch for miles. The stranger stopped at the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the layout. 3 men stood near the main house talking, too many to approach directly. He needed information first. He rode into town instead, stopping at the general store. The clerk looked up as he entered, then quickly looked away when their eyes met. The stranger had that effect on people. They noticed him. They remembered him. They usually preferred not to. A cup of coffee, he said, his voice low. He didn't sit at the counter, just leaned against the wall, watching the door. The clerk poured the coffee without meeting his eyes again. On the house, he mumbled. The stranger nodded. Mortimer Langford. Where does he live? The clerk's hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down. Why are you asking about Mortimer? Just business, the stranger replied. He didn't elaborate. He lives above the notary office, the clerk said quickly. The one next to the sheriff's station. The stranger took a sip of coffee. It was bitter, but he didn't mind. What kind of business does he do with Silas Thorne? The clerk swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. The stranger set the cup down. Everyone in this town knows what you're talking about. Mortimer signs papers. Silas gets land. That's the arrangement. The clerk looked toward the door, then back at the stranger. Mortimer, He has a family. He does what he has to. I understand, the stranger said. Where would Silas hide something valuable? Something he took from the Ashworth place? The clerk hesitated, then leaned closer. The old safe in his study, the one behind the portrait of his father. The stranger nodded. Thank you. He left the store and made his way to the notary office. Mortimer Langford's rooms were above, accessible by a separate entrance on the side. The stranger climbed the stairs, his boots making no sound on the worn wood. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. Mortimer Langford sat at a desk, staring blankly at a wall. His hands were tied behind his back. A gag was in his mouth. His eyes were wide with fear. The stranger moved quickly, cutting the ropes with his knife. "Where is the original deed?" he asked, his voice urgent. Mortimer shook his head, then pointed toward the window. "They're watching me," he whispered after the gag was removed. "Silas knows you're asking questions." "Who took the deed?" the stranger pressed. "I don't know," Mortimer said, his voice trembling. "Silas sent men to the Ashworth place. They found it in the false bottom of her desk. He paid me to forge the replacement." "Where is the original now?" Mortimer shook his head again. "He never told me. Said it was safer if I didn't know." The stranger straightened up. "He has it hidden somewhere. Somewhere no one would think to look." As if on cue, a sound came from downstairs. Footsteps, more than one pair. "They're coming," Mortimer whispered, panic in his eyes. The stranger moved to the window. Two men stood below, looking up at the notary office. They had rifles in their hands. "We have to go," the stranger said. He helped Mortimer to his feet, then led him to the back stairs. They descended quickly, quietly. The alley behind the notary office was narrow and dark. The stranger pushed Mortimer toward the end of the alley. "Go to the poorhouse," he said. "Tell Arabella what you told me, about the safe, about Silas watching you." Mortimer nodded, then disappeared into the maze of back streets. The stranger turned back toward the alley entrance. The two men from below were entering now, their rifles raised. They saw him immediately. "Well, well," one of them said. "Look what we have here." The stranger didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his hand resting near his holster. "The boss wants to have a word with you," the other man said, taking a step forward. The stranger moved then, fast, too fast for them to react. He disarmed the first man with a quick twist of his wrist, then struck the second with the butt of his rifle. They fell to the ground, unconscious. He didn't have time to tie them up. More footsteps were coming from the other end of the alley. He had to move. He slipped through a gap in the fence and found himself in an empty field. The trail had gone cold. Silas knew he was being investigated. The original deed could be anywhere now, buried, hidden, moved to another town. The stranger stood in the middle of the field, scanning the horizon. He had failed, or had he? Mortimer was safe. Arabella had a new lead about the safe in Silas's study. He needed help, someone who knew Silas, someone who might know where he would hide something valuable, someone who wasn't afraid to talk. His mind went back to the poorhouse, to Harriet Dunmore, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed the forgery but was too terrified to come forward. Maybe she knew more than she'd let on. Maybe she had seen something she hadn't mentioned. The stranger turned his horse and rode back toward town. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the landscape. He had to find Harriet before night fell, before Silas realized she might talk, before it was too late. The stranger rode through the fading light, his mind racing. Silas knew he was asking questions. The original deed could be anywhere now, hidden, moved, destroyed. He had to find Harriet Dunmore before night fell, before Silas realized she might talk. As he approached the poorhouse, he noticed something wrong. Too quiet. The usual sounds of displaced families settling in for the night were absent. No crying children, no hushed conversations. Just an unnatural silence. He dismounted quietly, his hand resting near his holster. The door to the poorhouse was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly. The room was empty. Not just empty of people, stripped bare. Beds overturned, personal belongings scattered on the floor. Arabella and her children were gone. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Silas had done this, taken Arabella, probably to silence her, to make sure she couldn't talk about the deed. Outside, a sound, footsteps, more than one pair, coming from the alley behind the poorhouse. The stranger moved quickly to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. 3 men stood in the alley, rifles in hand. They weren't looking at the poorhouse. They were looking at him. "Well, well," one of them said, spotting him. "The boss was right. You'd come back?" The stranger didn't wait. He turned and bolted for the back door, bursting through just as the first shots rang out. Bullets whizzed past his head, splintering the wood beside him. He ran across the small yard, diving behind a water trough just as more shots hit the ground where he'd been standing. The men advanced cautiously, spreading out to surround him. "No escape this time," one of them called out. "The boss wants you alive, for now." The stranger peered around the edge of the trough. 3 men, all armed, all moving in. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't dead yet. He waited until they were close. Then he moved, fast, rolling out from behind the trough, coming up with his revolver drawn. 2 shots rang out in quick succession. 2 men went down. The 3rd man fired, the bullet grazing the stranger's arm. He stumbled back, pain flaring through his shoulder, but he kept his feet. He fired again. The man dropped his rifle and clutched his chest. The stranger stood there, breathing heavily. The pain in his arm a sharp reminder that this was now personal. Silas had sent men to kill him, had taken Arabella, had destroyed the only safe place she had left. He checked the alley. No one else coming. He needed to find Arabella, needed to find the original deed. But first, he needed to tend to his wound. He tore a strip from his shirt, tying it tightly around his arm to slow the bleeding. The pain was intense, but he could ignore it. For now. As he stood there, a thought struck him. Silas had known he'd come back to the poorhouse, had known he'd look for Harriet. Someone had told him, someone close to the investigation. Mortimer, the notary. Even though the stranger had set him free, Mortimer had probably gone straight to Silas, told him everything. About the safe, about Harriet. The stranger's jaw tightened. He had failed to protect Arabella, failed to keep the investigation secret, failed to find the original deed. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Silas thought he had won, thought he had eliminated the threat. He had no idea what was coming. The stranger mounted his horse, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. He rode out of town, heading toward Harriet Dunmore's house. If Silas had taken Arabella, he might have taken Harriet too, or he might have left her as bait. Either way, the stranger was going to find out. And when he did, Silas Thorne would regret ever crossing him. The stranger rode through the moonlit night, his arm throbbing with every movement. The wound wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily, and the pain kept him alert. He had to find Harriet Dunmore before Silas did something worse to Arabella and her children. Harriet's house was small and tucked away at the edge of town, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. The stranger approached cautiously, his hand resting near his holster. The house was dark, quiet, too quiet. He dismounted and walked to the door, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden porch. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. "Harriet? It's me," The man from the poorhouse. Still no answer. The stranger tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly. "Harriet!" he called into the darkness. A faint whimper came from the corner of the room. The stranger moved toward the sound, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Harriet sat huddled on the floor, her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was trembling uncontrollably. "Are you all right?" the stranger asked, kneeling beside her. Harriet flinched at his touch. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "He'll know you were here. He'll hurt someone else because of you." "Who will?" the stranger asked gently. "Silas." Harriet nodded, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "He came for Arabella, took her and the children, said if anyone helped you, they'd regret it." The stranger's jaw tightened. "Did he come here?" Harriet shook her head. "Not yet, but he will. He always does." The stranger looked around the small room. His eyes fell on a loose floorboard near the fireplace. Something glinted in the moonlight, filtering through the window. "What's under that board?" he asked, pointing. Harriet's eyes widened. "Nothing. Just old things." The stranger stood and knelt by the fireplace. He pried the floorboard loose. Rolled up inside was a yellowed piece of paper, tied with a faded red ribbon. "The original deed," Harriet breathed, her voice filled with awe and terror. The stranger carefully untied the ribbon and unrolled the paper. There it was. Arabella's deed to the Ashworth land, signed by her father, witnessed by the town's previous sheriff, dated 3 years before Silas had even come to town. "How did you get this?" the stranger asked, his voice soft. Harriet wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I saw them take it from Arabella's desk. I followed them. When they went to Silas's office, I waited until they left. Then I came here and hid it. I knew it was wrong what they were doing, but I was too scared to say anything." The stranger nodded slowly. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" Harriet asked, her voice trembling. "Now Silas knows I helped Arabella. He'll come for me next." The stranger looked at the old woman, at the fear in her eyes, at the courage it had taken her to keep this deed safe all these years. "I need you to come with me," he said, "to the land registry office tomorrow morning." Harriet shook her head violently. "No, I can't. Silas will be there. He'll know I'm there." "You won't be alone," the stranger said. "I'll be with you, and we'll have witnesses." "Who?" Harriet asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The people Silas has hurt, the families whose land he stole. They'll come when they see what's happening." Harriet looked from the stranger to the deed in his hands. What if it doesn't work? What if he gets away with it? The stranger met her gaze, his eyes steady in the dim light. "Then we try again, but I don't think that will happen, because this time we have the truth. And we're not alone." Harriet took a shuddering breath. She looked at the deed, then back at the stranger. "All right," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'll do it, for Arabella, for her children." The stranger nodded. "Good, get some rest. We'll leave at dawn." He helped Harriet to her feet, then carefully replaced the floorboard. The deed was safe, for now. But dawn was coming, and with it, a confrontation that would change everything for this town. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange as the stranger helped Harriet Dunmore onto his horse. They rode through the quiet streets of town, the only sounds the clip-clop of hooves on the wooden boardwalks and the occasional early bird chirping from the trees. Harriet clutched the deed to her chest, her knuckles white with fear. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Silas won't take kindly to being embarrassed in public." The stranger didn't answer. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the land registry office ahead. He knew what they were walking into, knew Silas would be there, knew the corrupt Sheriff Marlowe would side with him, but he also knew they had the truth on their side. They dismounted in front of the land registry office. A small crowd had already gathered. Townspeople who had heard rumors, families who had lost their land to Silas, curious onlookers drawn by the unusual hour. "What's going on here?" Sheriff Marlowe demanded, stepping out of the office. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered pistol. The stranger ignored him. He walked straight to the door, Harriet following close behind. "We need to authenticate a document," he said, his voice calm but firm. Marlowe stepped in their path. "The office doesn't open until 9 o'clock. Come back then." The stranger didn't move. "This can't wait. There's a forged deed that needs to be exposed." Silas Thorne appeared in the doorway then, a smirk on his face. "Is that so? And what forged deed would that be?" The stranger reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the yellowed document. "This one, the original deed to the Ashworth property." Silas's smirk faltered. "Where did you get that?" "From where you hid it," the stranger replied, "after your men stole it from Arabella's desk." He unrolled the deed, revealing the signatures, the date, the official seal. "This is the real one, the one you had Mortimer Langford forge a copy of." A murmur went through the crowd. People shifted nervously, glancing from the stranger to Silas to the sheriff. "That's ridiculous," Silas said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "That document is a fake. Look at the ink. Look at the signatures." The stranger pointed to specific details on the deed. "The ink is consistent with the period. The signatures match those in the county records. The seal is authentic. We can have the county clerk verify it right now." He turned to the crowd. "How many of you have lost your land to Silas Thorne? How many of you were told your deeds were legitimate, only to find out later they were forged?" Several hands went up. Voices called out from the crowd. "My family lost our farm last year." "He took my uncle's ranch." "The deed he showed us looked different from this one." Silas's face turned red with anger. "This is a conspiracy. You're all lying to take what's rightfully mine." The stranger took a step forward. "The only thing that's rightfully yours is what you've earned honestly, not what you've stolen through forgery and intimidation." He turned to Sheriff Marlowe. "Arrest him. For fraud. For theft. For forgery." Marlowe hesitated, his hand still on his pistol. "I can't do that. Silas is a respected member of this community." "Respected?" someone in the crowd shouted. "He's a thief!" The stranger held up the deed. "This is the truth, and today the truth will be known." As he spoke, Mortimer Langford appeared at the back of the crowd. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked directly at Silas, then at the stranger, and slowly nodded. Silas saw the movement. His eyes darted around, taking in the crowd, the deed, the sheriff's hesitation. He knew he was cornered, knew the game was up. But the stranger wasn't finished yet. There was still one more revelation to make, one more truth to expose. And when it came out, nothing would ever be the same for Silas Thorne or this town. The stranger held up the deed, his voice cutting through the tension. "This document is authentic. The seal is real. The signatures match those in the county records. We can have the county clerk verify it right now." Silas's face paled. His eyes darted from the deed to the crowd, then back to the stranger. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You must have forged it." The stranger shook his head. "I found it where you hid it, after your men stole it from Arabella's desk." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People who had lost their land to Silas began to speak up, their voices growing stronger with each passing moment. "My family lost everything because of him," one man shouted. "He showed us a deed just like this one." "Mine too," another voice called out. "The ink looked fresh. The signatures were shaky." Sheriff Marlowe shifted uncomfortably, his hand still on his pistol. "This is highly irregular," he said, though his heart wasn't in it anymore. The tide had turned. The stranger turned to Silas. "There's something else you should know, something the town deserves to hear." Silas's eyes widened with recognition. "Don't," he whispered, but it was too late. "Silas Thorne is actually Arabella Ashworth's brother," the stranger revealed. "Cast out by their father years ago, he came back not just to take her land, but to reclaim what he believed should have been his inheritance." Arabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas, is that true?" Silas's shoulders slumped. "I had no choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Father left everything to you. When I came back I found you'd married, had children. I thought this was the only way." The stranger unrolled the deed completely. "This land belongs to Arabella and her children. It has always belonged to them." Mortimer Langford stepped forward. "It's true," he said. "I helped Silas forge the replacement deed. I knew it was wrong, but he paid me well, threatened me if I didn't cooperate." Sheriff Marlowe finally moved, holstering his pistol and approaching Silas. "I'm placing you under arrest, Silas, for fraud, for theft, for intimidation." As the sheriff led Silas away, Arabella stepped forward. She took the deed from the stranger's hands, her fingers trembling as she held the document that represented her family's entire legacy. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." The stranger shook his head. "No thanks needed. The truth was enough." He turned and walked away, not waiting for more words, not looking back. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, heading west. The deed was authenticated. The false claim was undone. The family was restored. His work was done. As he disappeared over the horizon, Arabella stood tall, her children running to embrace her. The crowd cheered, not just for her victory, but for the truth that had finally come to light. In a town where no one dared to act, one cowboy had said, "Her land is not yours," and everything had changed. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.